Hello, dear listeners. Tonight I am taking you to the coldest reality of the Middle Ages. Forget the glorious castle life that Hollywood has shown you, because the reality is much more brutal. Nobles shivering between stone walls, frozen wine chalices, and lords finding ice crystals on their beds in the morning. Spending a winter in a medieval castle was nothing less than a struggle for survival. Behind the nightly tales romanticised by historians lies the raw story of people trying to live in a stone labyrinth at -10 degrees Celsius. What you will hear tonight will reveal the truths covered by fur coats, the freezing cold inside thick walls, and the struggle for a cup of hot soup. Welcome to the Another Life History channel. If you enjoy this kind of historical content, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, don't forget to write in the comments where you are listening from and what the temperature is outside right now. Perhaps you are in a warm environment at this moment, listening to this story in much more comfortable conditions than the medieval lords. Now, dim the lights. Lie back where you are, and let's journey together toward the freezing stone walls, smouldering fireplaces, and the medieval noble life struggling against the deadly cold of winter. Because what you learn tonight will strike you with history's coldest and most brutal realities. You wake up on a dark winter night and feel the call of nature. Today this simply means a bathroom located just a few steps away. But if you lived in a stone-walled castle in the 14th century, this call could literally become a matter of life and death. Going to the toilet in medieval castles was not an ordinary necessity. It was a dangerous adventure that required courage and strategy. The latrine systems, one of the least talked about but perhaps most critical issues of castle life, were filled with difficulties that the modern mind cannot comprehend. Nobles who feasted in magnificent halls, wore grand armour, and showed courage on battlefields would risk their lives at certain hours of the day just to fulfill their most natural needs. The latrine system in castles was located in special sections called the garderobe. This name came from the French word for wardrobe, because people also hung their clothes there. The reason was quite practical. The smell of ammonia rising from human waste kept fleas and other pests away. Therefore, the best place to protect your valuable fabrics was right next to the foul-smelling latrine. These small chambers were usually built as small towers protruding outward from the castle walls. Inside there was a wooden seat with a deep shaft underneath that opened directly to the outside of the castle. The waste would fall through this opening into the castle moats, rivers, or simply to the base of the castle wall. There was no filtration system, sewage network, or hygiene measures. Everything mixed directly back into nature. In the winter months, this system became a total nightmare. First of all, the cold turned the wooden seat ice cold. Sitting on this surface with bare skin brought the risk of frostbite. Some wealthy families used covers made of animal skins to solve this problem. Some even had small cushions specially prepared for this purpose. The wind was also a major issue. The cold winds blowing against the castle walls would rush up through the latrine shafts, freezing the person sitting there. This wasn't just discomfort, it meant a serious risk of disease. Many castle residents suffered from kidney inflammation, bladder infections, and more serious urinary tract system diseases. The necessity of going to the toilet at night was a complete horror movie scenario. Castles became entirely different places in the dark. Trying to reach the latrine through narrow and winding corridors, extinguished torches, and echoing sounds required great courage. Moreover, there was the risk of slipping, falling, or losing one's way during this journey. The most dangerous situation was the moment you felt the need to use the latrine during an enemy attack. Castles under siege were frequently subjected to arrow and catapult attacks. The garderobe towers protruding from the castle walls served as perfect targets. Throughout history, many nobles died while using the latrine caught by an enemy arrow. The issue of hygiene was altogether horrific. There was no toilet paper. Instead, straw, leaves, pieces of fabric, or, in the most luxurious cases, Wool were used. Water for cleaning was also limited. Most of the time, people could only wash their hands with cold water. Soap was considered a luxury and was generally used only on very special occasions. One of the most embarrassing situations for castle inhabitants was the need to use the toilet while hosting guests. According to social rules, leaving the table during a feast was considered a great rudeness. Because of this, many people had to wait for hours, which led to serious health problems. For women, the situation was even more difficult. Moving around in narrow latrine chambers while wearing heavy layered dresses was quite challenging. Furthermore, access to these chambers was nearly impossible for pregnant women. Many women, therefore, preferred to use simple containers inside the room as nighttime chamber pots. During winter months, the problem of frozen waste also occurred. Solid waste accumulating in the latrine shafts would freeze and pile up. When spring arrived and these piles began to melt, unbearable odours would spread around the castle. In this case, the castle residents faced the risk of disease and epidemics. Another danger of the guardrobe system was the issue of structural safety. These chambers protruding from the castle wall could sometimes collapse. Especially in older castles, the stonework would deteriorate over time, and these small towers carried the risk of caving in. The chances of survival for someone experiencing a collapse while using the latrine were quite low. The situation was even more dire for children. Young castle residents had great difficulty using these systems designed for adults. Since the risk of falling was very high, children usually had to use the latrine under adult supervision. One of the most terrifying stories involved sabotage attacks. Enemy soldiers would sometimes try to enter the castle through the latrine shafts. Assassins trying to infiltrate the castle by climbing up these narrow and filthy passages could kill nobles in their unguarded moments. Using a latrine in medieval castles was full of difficulties unimaginable by today's standards. It is impossible not to respect the hardships faced by these people trying to fulfill their most natural needs under the risk of cold, darkness, lack of hygiene, disease, the danger of falling, and even death. To understand what a great blessing modern toilet technology is, it is enough to imagine castle life in the Middle Ages. Those quiet moments when the first light of day hit the castle walls actually heralded the beginning of a period of intense activity. Long before the sun rose, even before the first light appeared in the sky, a secret waking ceremony began for everyone living in the castle. This ritual was such a complex and delicate system that it was a critical process where a single mistake could upset the entire order of the castle. One of the most mysterious and lesser-known aspects of castle life, the morning awakening ceremonies, was built on a strict hierarchy and timing system. Different waking hours, different ways of waking up, and different morning routines were determined for people of every class. The reason behind this system was not just order, but also security, prestige, and social control. At the highest level, the awakening ceremony of the Lord and his family was like a true work of art. The Lord's personal valet, the valet de chambre, had learned to enter the room silently without disturbing his master's sleep. The first task was to revive the fireplace in the room and bring the room temperature to an appropriate level. This process was done so quietly that the Lord would not even wake up yet. Once the room warmed up, the valet would approach the Lord's bed and begin the waking process with a special ritual. This ritual was extremely gentle and respectful so as not to disturb the Lord's mood. He would first make his presence known with a slight cough, then begin speaking with predetermined phrases like, "My Lord, the new day begins." The Lord's waking was also subject to a specific protocol. He would not get straight out of bed. He would first recite his morning prayers, then discuss the day's plans with his valet. During this process, room servants would silently prepare clothes and send word to the kitchen for breakfast service. The lady's awakening ceremony was even more complex. Her private female servant, the femme de chambre, was responsible for coordinating her mistress's beauty routines and clothing preparations. the lady's awakening meant not just getting up, but also preparing the first appearance of the day. Hairstyling, facial care, and choosing a dress were part of a long process that began in the early hours of the morning. Children, on the other hand, were subject to different waking routines depending on their age. Young princes and princesses were awakened by their nannies with special songs and stories. This was not only a show of affection, but also a psychological method to ensure the children were mentally prepared for the start of the day. For knights and nobles, the awakening ritual took on a more military character. Rising before the morning call to prayer, these warriors spent the first hours of the day training and preparing. Armour checks, weapon maintenance, and preparing the horses were integral parts of their morning routines. For the servant class, the awakening system functioned entirely differently. The lowest level servants rose in the final hours of the night and began working before dawn to get the entire castle ready. Kitchen staff lit the fires, cleaners swept the corridors, and gardeners fed the animals. The most mysterious aspect of the door-knocking ritual was the strict system of rules regarding who could knock on which doors. Servants could not knock directly on the Lord's door. This task belonged only to high-ranking valets. Similarly, lower-level staff were not permitted to approach the ladies' chambers. There were different knocking patterns and codes for every door. 3 light taps indicated an emergency, 2 long taps meant normal service, and a single powerful strike announced the arrival of an important guest. This code system was so advanced that experienced castle residents could tell who was coming and for what purpose just by the sound of the door. The hardest part of the morning awakening ceremonies was the requirement for silence. While most of the castle residents were still asleep, the servants had to carry out all preparations quietly. Everything from footsteps and voices to the opening and closing of doors and the carrying of items was kept under strict control. In the winter months, these rituals became even more difficult. The cold air caused sounds to echo more clearly. Furthermore, the prolonged darkness increased the use of candles and torches, which created a fire risk. While servants took care not to fall on ice-covered stairs, they also had to ensure their duties were not neglected. Religious rituals were also an important part of the morning awakening ceremonies. The morning mass in the castle chapel was a sacred moment that united everyone around a common purpose. The sound of the bells reached every corner of the castle, declaring the official start of the day. Dining hall preparation was the most critical aspect of the morning rituals. The table setting, the temperature of the food, and the timing of the service had to be perfect. By the time the Lord and his family sat at the breakfast table, all preparations had to be complete. Security checks were also an indispensable part of the morning routines. The handover from night watchmen to day guards was vital for the continuity of the castle's security. Gate checks, rampart inspections, and armory controls were repeated every morning. One of the most interesting rituals was the practice of weather divination. Experienced castle residents would try to predict the day's weather by observing the sky, wind direction, and animal behaviour. This information was crucial for daily work planning. The social dimension of the morning awakening ceremonies was also quite striking. During these rituals, daily gossip was shared among castle residents, news spread, and social networks were strengthened. Servant women met in the kitchen, while male servants gathered in the stables. Viewed through today's eyes, the dawn rituals in medieval castles formed an extremely complex and detailed system. To live through these morning ceremonies, where every movement was calculated, every sound controlled, and every behaviour conformed to protocol, was a challenging experience requiring discipline and harmony. As you approach the magnificent dining table standing in the middle of the great hall, the smell that hits your nose is not the delicious aroma of food you expected. You're met by a nauseating wave of scent made of a mixture of sour wine, mouldy bread, and meat of uncertain origin. Welcome to the medieval castle tables. Here you enter a world where hunger is more powerful than luxury, and survival comes before the pleasure of taste. The drama experienced in castle kitchens during the winter months had nothing to do with the flamboyant feast shown in Hollywood movies. The truth is, in the freezing cold of a winter that lasted for months, finding fresh food was nearly impossible. Castle residents tried to survive on preserves prepared in the summer, salted meats, and food of extremely questionable quality that remained by chance. The story of wine was particularly tragic. Large wine barrels were kept in the castle cellars and literally froze on cold days. As frozen wine thawed, the fermentation process broke down, the drink turned sour and became undrinkable. But since there was no other option, this soured liquid, sometimes turned into vinegar, still took its place on the tables. Even wealthy nobles tried to drink their frozen wine by heating it up and adding spices. The meat situation was even more horrific. Meats that were attempted to be preserved through salting and drying methods became unrecognizable by the end of winter. Too much salt hardened the meat like a mummy. Too little led to rot. Most of the time, cooks had to taste the meat just to see if it had gone bad. Meat that had changed colour, developed a foul odour and lost its texture was hidden under heavy spices and sauces. The bread situation was perhaps the most tragic. Due to moisture and cold, bread moulded very quickly. The mouldy parts of the bread were scraped off and the remaining pieces were rebaked. Sometimes the mould was so widespread that more than half of the bread had to be thrown away. In such cases, castle residents were forced to eat bread made from strange mixtures of cornmeal, bitter herbs, and even wood shavings. Dairy products were a total gamble. When cheeses got too hard, they were cut with saws. When they were too soft, they spoiled, emitting a terrible stench. Butter usually tasted bitter, and milk turned sour. Cooks tried various methods to save these products, but most of the time, the result was a disappointment. The vegetable situation was even more dire. Finding fresh vegetables in the middle of winter was impossible. Sprouting or rotted parts of onions, carrots, and cabbage stored in the castle warehouses were cut away, and the remaining bits were used in meals. Sometimes, after cleaning the rotten part of a vegetable, the remaining piece was so small it could only be used for flavouring. The fish issue was particularly absurd. Salted fish would harden like stone by the end of winter and emit a terrible smell. To make these fish edible, they had to be soaked in water for days, beaten and heavily spiced. In the end, what emerged was more like a pile of spices than fish. The most interesting rescue operations happened in the kitchen. Cooks showed incredible creativity to make spoiled food edible. Rotten meats were boiled for a long time, then fried, then buried in piles of spices and covered with sauces. The goal was not taste, but to satisfy hunger. In large feasts, the situation became even more tragicomic. The host lord, who had to offer the best food to his guests, expected miracles from his cooks. The cooks, meanwhile, sweated as they tried to create masterpieces with spoiled ingredients. Consequently, the dishes brought to the table could look impressive but taste horrific. For children, the situation was even more heartbreaking. Their small stomachs could not handle these heavy and spoiled foods, and then they were constantly getting sick. Mothers tried to prepare soft foods for their children, but options were extremely limited. Most of the time, children were fed with bread water and diluted soup. The situation for servants was even worse. The leftovers of the meals prepared for the nobles and the most spoiled parts were left to them. Even kitchen scraps were considered valuable. Edible pieces were searched for. Bone broth, breadcrumbs, and vegetable peelings were the basic ingredients of servant tables. Strange food combinations were also common. Sweet was mixed with salty, meat was combined with fruit, and odd sauces were tried. These mixtures often caused nausea, but hunger made everything edible. One of the most horrific moments was finding live insects or worms in the middle of a meal. Stored grains and flours became infested. Worms coming out of bread and insects in grain dishes had become ordinary occurrences. People were so accustomed to this that they would simply pick out the insects and continue eating. Towards the end of winter, When the castle warehouses began to empty, the situation became even more serious. Herbs and grains normally used as animal feed were offered for human consumption. People even tried to boil and eat pieces of leather when they were starving. Spending a winter at medieval castle tables was full of hardships unthinkable by today's standards. It is nauseating even to imagine the suffering of people forced to eat spoiled food, struggling with hunger, and trying everything to stay alive. You are in the 9th month of your pregnancy, and your labour pains begin during the harshest days of winter. Although the thick stone walls around you seem to protect you, this moment is actually the most dangerous of your life. Giving birth as a noble woman in the Middle Ages meant dancing on a thin line between life and death, and the winter months increased this risk manifold. In the Middle Ages, childbirth was one of the greatest life-threatening challenges women faced. Statistics revealed the horrific reality. 1 in 5 women died during or after childbirth. Although this rate was slightly lower for noble women, the additional dangers of giving birth in winter neutralized the advantages provided by social status. The greatest enemy in winter was the cold, and the stone walls fed this enemy. Despite the fireplace, castle rooms remained ice cold. Braziers and torches used to increase the temperature of the birthing room created a lack of oxygen and made breathing difficult due to smoke. Cold air negatively affected the woman's blood circulation during birth and weakened the body's natural defense mechanisms. The risk of infection peaked in the winter months. Finding clean water became difficult as existing water sources froze. While midwives tried to obtain lukewarm water to wash their hands, they often had to settle for ice-cold water. In a period when hygiene conditions were already primitive, cleanliness became nearly impossible in winter. The birthing position also caused great problems. Noble women usually gave birth standing or kneeling, because giving birth lying down was considered a sign of lowliness. The cold stone floor created a risk of frostbite for bare feet and caused muscles to contract. This situation prolonged the labour process and increased the risk of complications. Nutritional deficiencies became even more pronounced in winter. Fresh fruits and vegetables could not be found, and vitamin deficiencies became widespread. When the nutritional needs of pregnant women were not met, the health of both the mother and the baby was put in serious danger. Iron deficiency caused anemia, and calcium deficiency led to bone problems. The level of medical knowledge was extremely primitive. Midwives based their experience on oral tradition and often relied on superstitions. Intervention options for complications during birth were extremely limited. Caesarean sections were only performed to save the baby if the mother died, and it meant a death sentence for the mother. In the winter months, reaching a physician was also nearly impossible. Roads were closed due to snow and storms, making it very difficult to call a doctor. The only medical support inside the castle was limited to the knowledge of experienced midwives and luck. In this situation, women were left completely helpless against birth complications. Herbal medicines used as painkillers were not found in winter or became ineffective. Pain-relieving plants like poppy, lemon, balm and chamomile lost their effectiveness when they were not fresh. Women had to face horrific pains with raw courage, often suffering enough to lose consciousness. Controlling bleeding during birth was also a major issue. Finding clean cloths became difficult. Existing cloths would mould in the damp and cold environment. Traditional methods used to stop bleeding became ineffective in winter conditions, leaving women at risk of dying from blood loss. The situation was even more dramatic regarding infant care. Newborn babies were extremely vulnerable to hypothermia. The coldness of the castle rooms made it nearly impossible for infants to maintain their body temperature. Infant mortality rates doubled or tripled during the winter months. Breast milk problems were also common. Cold and malnutrition negatively affected the mother's milk production, leaving babies to suffer from hunger. In an era where alternative feeding options were extremely limited, the babies of mothers who could not produce milk generally did not survive. Post-birth infection risk also peaked in winter. postpartum infections were much more frequent in cold and damp environments. The inabilities to find clean replacement materials delayed the healing of wounds and created a risk of sepsis. The issue of mental support was also important. The confinement and gloom brought by the winter months increased postpartum depression. Since social support networks narrowed in winter conditions, women were left alone with loneliness and despair. The situation was even more dire in multiple births. For women pregnant with twins or triplets, a winter birth meant almost certain death. The survival chances for both the mother and the infants dropped to minimal levels. The risk of premature birth also increased in winter. Cold weather and stress factors could lead to early labour, resulting in underdeveloped babies being born and dying immediately. Family support during birth was also limited. Since male family members were forbidden from entering the birthing room, women could only receive support from other women. Due to travel difficulties in winter, female relatives might not be able to come, leaving expectant mothers alone. The bitterest reality was that the memories of women who died in childbirth were quickly forgotten. Due to high death rates, society had normalized these losses, accepting female deaths as a part of destiny. Winter birth in medieval castle life was full of hardships we cannot even imagine in the modern era. Remembering the pain and struggle of these brave women helps us understand how valuable today's medical opportunities are. You have a rising fever, a worsening cough, and an unbearable headache. In the modern world, going to the doctor and getting a prescription is as close as a phone call. But when you overlook the reality that you are in a medieval castle, despair settles over you. The nearest physician is days away. Winter conditions have blocked the roads, and you find yourself face to face with death. At this exact point, the strange, sometimes effective and often dangerous treatment methods developed by castle residents over centuries come into play. When illness suddenly broke out in castle life, the first intervention always came from the same person, the elderly women. These experienced ladies were the first hope of castle residents with their folk medicine knowledge passed down from generation to generation. They tried to fight the disease with herbal mixtures, home-produced medicines and strange rituals. Methods for reducing fever were particularly creative. Cold compresses were applied to the patient's body. They tried to bathe them in ice-cold water. Even snow was rubbed on the body when found. While these methods sometimes worked, they often drove the patient into hypothermia. Alternatively, cloth soaked in vinegar were placed on the patient's forehead and onion slices were tied to their feet. Cough treatment was a complete process of trial and error. Horrific sweet mixtures consisting of honey, garlic and onion were prepared and forced down the patient's throat. Honeyed onion juice, mint tea, linden infusions, and even boiled earthworm mixtures were used as cough syrup. One of the most interesting methods was rubbing warm animal butter on the patient's chest and placing a wool cover over it. The methods used in wound treatment were even stranger. Honey was applied to open wounds and clean fabric was tied over it. Since honey truly possesses antibacterial properties, this method sometimes worked. A more savage alternative was pouring fresh animal urine on wounds, as it was believed that urine had a sterilizing effect. The solutions developed for stomach aches were quite diverse. Hot stones were placed on the stomach and cherry pit pillows were used. Sometimes the patient was turned upside down and given a stomach massage. Chamomile tea, fennel water and sage infusions were the basic medicines. In cases of severe abdominal pain, a small amount of alcohol was given to the patient, expecting it to numb the pain. In headache treatments, the most common method was temple massage. Tying a tight cloth around the head, applying cold compresses to the forehead, and light taps on the head were often the first methods tried. A more extreme solution was bloodletting from the patient's head. This procedure was usually performed by a barber and often made the patient's condition even worse. Treating broken bones was literally like a horror movie. While trying to set the broken bone, the patient was given a wooden stick to bite on to prevent them from screaming. Wooden splints were tied over the bone, and the patient's limbs were bound to prevent movement. High alcohol drinks were used as painkillers, given until the patient passed out. Garlic was king in the treatment of colds and flu. Swallowing raw garlic, sticking garlic into the nostrils, and inhaling garlic steam were the standard procedures. Besides this, hot wine, spicy soups, and sweat-inducing herbal mixtures were used. Patients were wrapped in thick covers and kept until they sweated. The methods developed against skin diseases were quite interesting. Vinegar was applied to itchy skin areas, and salt was sprinkled over it. Pieces of mouldy bread were placed on skin sores, expecting an antibiotic effect. Mixtures of animal urine and sweat were used against psoriasis. In eye diseases, the most common treatment was dripping saliva into the eye. Saliva, especially from an empty stomach, was dripped into the eye, expecting it to fight infection. Methods tried against eye inflammation included honey water, rubbing a silver coin on the eye, and even dripping raw egg white. In cases of nausea and vomiting, the patient would be given mint tea, and a warm compress was applied to the stomach. In cases of severe vomiting, the patient's feet were lifted high while the head was held downward. It was believed this position would soothe the stomach ailment. The solutions developed for sleep disorders were quite gentle. Teas prepared from calming herbs like lavender, chamomile and lemon balm were administered. These plants were burned near the patient. To induce sleep, a light amount of alcohol was sometimes given, expecting relaxation. In the most hopeless situations, religious rituals came into play. Prayers were recited for the patient, holy relics were placed upon them, and a priest was called to perform the last rites. These rituals provided psychological support more than medical treatment. Bloodletting was a method tried for almost every disease. Blood was taken from the arm, neck, or groin, believing the body would be purified of bad blood. This process often weakened the patient further and delayed recovery. Herbal treatments were the most common and relatively safest methods. Medicinal herbs grown in castle gardens were dried and stored for winter use. Plants like sage, mint, chamomile, linden, and echinacea were used against various illnesses. Animal-sourced treatments were also common. Chicken broth was believed to give strength to patients, and bone broth was especially preferred. Cod liver oil, royal jelly, and even various animal organs were used as medicine. One of the most dangerous treatment methods was cauterization by fire. Against chronic pain, iron bars were heated in the fire and pressed onto the painful area. This seemingly barbaric method sometimes actually managed to soothe the pain. In medieval castles, when a doctor was unavailable, the struggle against disease was carried out with methods that were primitive but creative by today's standards. While these treatments sometimes yielded miraculous results, they often increased the patient's suffering. Walking alone in the castle during the third hour of the night, your footsteps echo through the stone corridors. The flickering candle flame in your hand creates dancing shadows on the walls, and at every corner you feel as though the unknown is waiting for you. Being a night watchman in the Middle Ages was a struggle for existence balanced between life and death, pushing the limits of courage and endurance. The night watchmen, who formed the backbone of castle security, were not ordinary castle residents sleeping during the day. These men were a special class struggling against the fear and uncertainty brought by darkness. Working on a shift system, the guards were responsible for patrolling the castle throughout the night, investigating suspicious sounds and detecting potential dangers in advance. Being selected for the profession of watchman was not easy. Those undertaking this duty had to be physically strong, mentally balanced, and of a character that could cope with fear. This was because the events occurring in the castle during the night pushed the boundaries of what a normal person could endure. The greatest enemy was darkness. Corners that candle and torchlight could not reach became completely unknown territories. While moving through these dark areas, guards had to remain constantly alert. Enemy agents, thieves, or worse, assassins hiding among the shadows could strike at any moment. The most terrifying part of the night shift was the silence. After the hustle and bustle of the day, the absolute silence of the night amplified even the smallest sounds. The scurrying of a mouse, the wind hitting a window shutter, or the creaking of old wood was enough to put a guard on alert. Patrolling the dungeon section was one of the hardest tasks. The dark cells where prisoners were kept were filled with the smell of decay and cries of despair. While patrolling this section, guards had to prevent escape attempts while also ensuring their own safety. Some prisoners would try to trap the guards, using every kind of trick to gain their freedom. Walking on the tower stairs required a separate ordeal. Climbing narrow and steep stairs with heavy armour and weapons was a challenging physical feat. Moreover, the risk of slipping on these stairs was very high. The chance of survival for a falling guard was minimal. The weather was the guards' greatest test. Patrolling the ramparts on snowstorm nights meant standing guard under the risk of frostbite. Violent winds would extinguish torches, forcing the guards to stay in total darkness. In these situations, protecting both themselves and the castle became nearly impossible. Loneliness throughout the night created great psychological pressure. Watchmen, who were left alone with only their thoughts for hours without speaking to anyone, could start seeing hallucinations over time. These situations, arising from a combination of fatigue and stress, made it difficult for guards to do their jobs. The most dangerous moments were when suspicious sounds had to be investigated. When a strange noise was heard, the guard had to go to that area alone. During this investigation, the risk of encountering enemy soldiers, thieves, or attackers was very high. In these cases, guards had to be both brave and extremely cautious. The responsibility of sounding the alarm also created great stress. Warning the castle during a moment of real danger was the guards' most critical task, but sounding a false alarm required serious punishment. In this situation, guards were under constant pressure to make the right decision. On winter nights, they had to fight against hypothermia. Since thick clothing restricted mobility, guards tried to maintain their agility while fighting the cold. Using weapons with frozen fingers and walking on ice-covered stairs required great mastery. One of the most horrific experiences among guards was witnessing deaths. Residents who died of illness, those injured as a result of accidents or suspicious deaths, were traumatic situations that guards had to deal with throughout the night. Additionally, night watchmen became witnesses to the secret affairs of the castle residents. Forbidden love affairs, secret meetings, intrigues, and conspiracies did not escape their eyes. These situations put the guards in a difficult position, leaving them unsure of whose side to take. Nutrition was also a major problem. It was impossible to eat regular meals during night watch. Guards were forced to go hungry except for the small amount of food they carried with them. This reduced concentration and slowed reaction times. Guards whose sleep patterns were completely disrupted could not get quality sleep during the day. The noise inside the castle, the bustle of daily life, and the pressure to stay constantly awake wore the guards down physically. One of the greatest fears was the possibility of encountering supernatural events. Since the superstitions of medieval people were very strong, guards thought they might encounter spirits, ghosts, or demonic entities during the night. These fears created more stress than actual dangers. Another difficulty the guards faced was weapon maintenance. Damp air and cold caused weapons to rust. A guard who realised his weapon did not work in a critical moment found himself in an extremely dangerous situation. Working as a night watchman in medieval castles was full of hardships that today's security guards could not even imagine. The struggle these brave men gave for the castle's security at night turned them into true heroes. Amidst the sounds of the wind leaking through the thick stone walls on a cold winter night, whispers are heard. These are not just sounds made by the wind. They are whispers of forbidden loves, secret rendezvous, and dangerous betrayals. Winter in medieval castles was not only a time for struggling against the cold, but also a period when passions born from confinement, prohibitions, and dramatic love stories peaked. The closed-off life brought by living in a castle in winter intensified the emotional bonds between people. People stuck within the same walls for months began to see and feel details they wouldn't notice in normal times. Loves born in this atmosphere became both more intense and more dangerous. Forbidden relationships among the noble class created the riskiest situations. When a secret affair between a married lord and a young damsel was discovered, it turned into not just a moral scandal but also a political crisis. Especially between noble families connected by political marriages, such situations could break alliances and even lead to wars. The emotional contradictions experienced by ladies were particularly tragic. These women, married off to men they did not love for political reasons, could seek true love elsewhere. Platonic loves felt for young knights, handsome musicians, or even men from lower classes sometimes turned into physical relationships. And scandals broke out. Although romantic relationships among the servant class seemed freer, they carried their own unique risks. Relationships between servants of different statuses could disrupt the castle hierarchy and upset the work order. Relationships that upper-level servants had with those at lower levels were especially frowned upon. The most dangerous situation was relationships that crossed social classes. When a secret love between a noble lady and an ordinary soldier, or the lord's daughter and a valet was discovered, it could lead to horrific consequences. The man from the lower class would either be killed or sent into exile. As for the woman, she could be completely ostracized by her family. During the long nights of winter, organizing secret rendezvous became both easier and more difficult. Since darkness fell early, moving stealthily became easier, but the cold weather made outdoor meetings almost impossible. Lovers were forced to meet in enclosed spaces to stay warm, which increased the risk of being caught. Secret letters were the most common form of expressing love during the winter months. The elite, who were literate, conveyed their feelings through letters. These letters were usually carried by trusted servants and kept in great secrecy. However, a letter falling into the wrong hands could ruin the lives of those involved. The ways betrayals were discovered were quite diverse. Sometimes rivals acting out of jealousy would report them. Other times, situations witnessed by chance were exposed. The most painful discoveries occurred in moments when spouses witnessed it with their own eyes. Religious authorities took a very strict stance against these situations. Church law met the crime of adultery with heavy punishments, particularly targeting women. Due to these relationships deemed sinful, women could be confined to monasteries and men could be sent into exile. The gossip network within the castle played a major role in the spread of stories of love and betrayal. Rumours spreading among servant women soon reached the entire castle, and even untrue stories could create great dramas. Children were the most innocent victims of these situations. Children born of forbidden relationships were marginalised by society and forced to carry the stigma of being illegitimate. The future of these children was generally uncertain. Increased alcohol consumption during winter also led to an increase in forbidden relationships. Wrong decisions made under intoxication were met with great regret the next morning, but by then it was too late. Jealousy dramas, which included violence, occurred more frequently in winter. Betrayed spouses sought revenge, issued calls for duels, and sometimes fatal fights broke out. The most interesting situation created by winter confinement was unexpected connections. People who would never speak in normal times would start conversing during long winter nights. Over time, these conversations could turn into intimacy. Music and poetry were the primary tools for expressing love. Secret lovers composed songs for each other and wrote poems. These artistic works sometimes contained indirect confessions and served as messages for those who understood. Partings at the end of winter were particularly dramatic. When spring arrived, castle life would return to normal. The intimacies experienced throughout the winter would end. These temporary relationships sometimes turned into permanent pain, creating long-lasting melodramas. The most romantic stories occurred when true love overcame obstacles. The stories of couples who managed to surpass class differences, family pressures, and social barriers turned into legends passed down from generation to generation. Love and betrayal stories in medieval castles during winter were striking examples showing how humanity's most universal emotions were shaped under harsh conditions. These stories contain the most intense forms of both tragedy and romance. You are a 7-year-old child, and at 5 in the morning you are forced to step onto the icy stone floor with bare feet. Your tears freeze on your cheeks from the cold, but crying is forbidden, because a crying child can never be a lord. The education of noble children in medieval castle life was a system so harsh, brutal and dismissive of childhood that it would give modern parents nightmares. In the winter months, this training became even more savage. Small bodies had to struggle both with the cold and rigorous discipline. The education of noble boys began at age 4. At this age, the first thing expected of a child was to develop a tolerance for physical pain. Practices such as washing with cold water early in the morning, walking barefoot on stone floors, and spending time outside without thick clothing were part of the daily routine. The aim was to toughen the child's body and prepare them for future wars. On winter mornings, 6-year-old children were forced to do gymnastics in the freezing courtyard. Exercises like running, sit-ups and push-ups were performed in the freezing cold, and the children's breath would turn into steam. Children who fainted or cried during these sessions were punished and subjected to even harsher exercises. Combat training began at age 3 with wooden swords. These weapons, which were heavy for small hands, were deliberately made heavy to accelerate the children's muscle development. Practicing swordsmanship under the snow during winter months required both physical and mental endurance. Most children trying to hold a weapon with frozen fingers cried from pain. Discipline training was perhaps the most brutal part. Physical punishment was widely used to teach children to obey. Punishments such as beating, being left hungry, or staying alone in cold rooms were considered normal. Waiting for punishment in unheated rooms was like torture for the children, especially in winter. There were also strict rules regarding nutrition. To harden the palates of noble children, they were sometimes given spoiled food or left hungry. When food shortages occurred in winter, children were subjected to the same harsh conditions as adults. Learning to endure hunger was considered a requirement for surviving in times of war. Literacy education could also turn into torture. Children who did not learn Latin were punished with beatings and forced to repeat the same text for hours. Studying by candlelight in the darkness of winter nights tired the eyes and caused headaches. Horseback riding training was particularly dangerous. 5-year-old children were placed on top of large horses and forced to struggle not to fall. Riding a horse on icy ground in winter was a skill difficult even for experienced warriors. Children falling and getting injured was met as something ordinary. Education on social hierarchy also began at a very early age. Children were taught before whom to bow, with whom to speak, and whom to fear. Children who violated these rules were strictly warned. Sometimes people from the lower class were punished in front of their eyes to teach them a lesson. Religious education was also difficult. Children forced to stand motionless during long rites could not move even if their knees ached. Kneeling for hours on cold church stones in winter could be unbearable for small bodies. The loneliness test was one of the cruelest practices. Children were left alone in dark rooms at night, expected to face their fears. The length of winter nights made this test even harder. Children had to struggle with fear for hours. For the pain endurance test, small injuries were deliberately inflicted on children. With practices like pricking with needles, making small cuts, and creating burns, the children's reaction to pain was measured. Children who cried from pain were considered to have failed and were subjected to the test again. During hunting training, children were forced to kill animals. They were expected to kill a living being for the first time so that they would not hesitate when killing their enemies in the future. This deeply affected the children emotionally. Some experienced trauma. The education of girls was different but just as brutal. They were expected to perfectly learn skills like household management and embroidery at an early age. Girls who made mistakes were subjected to physical punishment, and perfection standards were kept very high. Marriage preparations also began very early. 10-year-old girls were taught how to obey their future husbands and how to manage a household. During this training, their personalities were suppressed, and their capacity for independent thought was stifled. Health education was equally rigorous. To teach children how to combat illness and treat injuries, they were given practice on real cases. They were expected to grow accustomed to the sight of blood and to remain undisturbed by witnessing pain. One of the most tragic situations was forcing siblings to compete against one another. To ensure strength regarding inheritance, siblings were turned into rivals, and the bonds of love between them were intentionally weakened. Even playing games was a part of the training. Children's games were organised as combat simulations, making even leisure competitive. Those who lost were punished, while the winners were rewarded. The education received by child lords in medieval winter castles was a system based on bullying, entirely removed from the modern understanding of children's rights. While most children who went through this training experienced trauma, it was believed that such a harsh preparation was necessary for survival, given the conditions of the period. There is a knock on your door, and the Lord's tax collectors appear on the threshold. While a snowstorm rages outside, they inspect the last sack of wheat your family has set aside for the winter. While your children cry from hunger, every grain of grain you give will go to the tables of the nobles in the castle, and you will once again try to balance life and death. To be a peasant in the Middle Ages meant struggling for your own survival, while simultaneously financing the luxurious life of your master. The tax collection system was one of the greatest sources of nightmares in a peasant's life. Lords demanded more taxes from peasants during the winter months to cover the expenses of castle life. Most of the resources needed for heating materials, food stocks, and castle maintenance came off the backs of the peasants. The most brutal type of tax was the harvest tax. Peasants had to give half, sometimes more, of their produce to the lord. This rate could increase even further in winter because the needs of the castle residents grew. Peasants were forced to hand over the bulk of their produce, knowing full well that their own families would go hungry throughout the winter. The arrival of tax collectors in the village meant total terror. These men were usually armed and ruthless. They beat peasants who could not pay, looted their homes, and harmed women and children. When peasants saw these men, they tried to flee, but their opportunities for escape were very limited. When cash could not be found, peasants were forced to give up their belongings. Livestock, agricultural tools, household items, and even clothing could be seized as tax. The situation was even more tragic for peasants who lost their animals in the winter months, as these animals were sources of both milk and meat. One of the most horrific situations was the child tax. Lords sometimes demanded the children of peasant families to take them as castle servants. This practice was technically considered a tax, but in reality, it was no different from slavery. Families were at risk of never seeing their children again. In winter, tax collection became even more tyrannical. Cold weather conditions broke the peasants' resistance, and the risk of the sick and elderly dying increased. But the tax collectors did not care about these things. They insisted on taking the designated amounts. The tax on women was especially shameful. A celibacy tax was collected from young unmarried women, while a fertility tax was demanded from married women. When these taxes could not be paid, women were subjected to physical violence and sometimes raped. Peasants' attempts to evade taxes were very risky games. Peasants caught trying to hide their produce faced very severe punishments. They could be subjected to beatings, imprisonment, confiscation of property, and even the death penalty. The most despotic lords increased tax amounts arbitrarily. Additional taxes were demanded from peasants for reasons such as castle construction, war preparations, or wedding ceremonies. These demands could not be rejected. Peasants took on extra burdens for every whim of their lords. A debt system had developed among peasants to pay taxes. Families unable to pay borrowed from neighbours, but repaying these debts often became impossible. Families caught in a debt spiral eventually lost their property and became completely destitute. Harassment of peasant women during tax collection was common. Tax collectors abused their power to exploit women, silencing men who opposed this with threats of death. Peasant women were subjected to both economic and sexual exploitation. Even when deaths increased due to disease and hunger, tax collection did not stop. The families of the deceased inherited the tax debts as a legacy. Therefore, even death brought no escape. Children were forced to pay the tax debts of their parents. Resistance attempts by peasants were very rare and very dangerous. Tax revolts were suppressed harshly, and rebels were executed. Since the peasants' means of organising were limited, collective resistance was nearly impossible. One of the most insidious types of tax was the road tax. Peasants had to pay taxes even when moving on their own lands. Going to the market, visiting a relative, or even going to fetch water was taxed. In winter months, peasants who could not pay their taxes sometimes had to break up their families. Children were given to different families, and family unity was destroyed. This situation broke the peasants psychologically and destroyed their hopes. Tax collectors searched houses thoroughly to find the peasants' hidden wealth. In these searches, household items were broken, women's valuables were stolen, and the family's privacy was mocked. One of the most tragic situations occurred when peasants had to sell their own children to pay taxes. Children sold to slave traders could never return to their families. This pain lasted a lifetime. It was considered normal for peasants who wanted to evade taxes to be subjected to torture. Through methods such as water torture, beating, and burning, peasants were forced to reveal their money. Some even died during these tortures. The tax burden on peasants was so heavy that often 80% of what they produced was taken as tax. The remaining amount was not enough to feed their families, and peasants lived constantly on the brink of starvation. The tax tyranny experienced by the medieval peasants reached dimensions that far exceed the modern understanding of justice. The suffering of these people remained as bitter memories, showing how valuable the concept of social justice is. Whispers are heard amidst the crackling sounds of the fire. This gathering, which looks like an intimate conversation of nobles gathered around the fireplace in the great hall of the castle, is actually a deadly council where bloody conspiracies are formed. The plans of betrayal hidden on faces where the light of the flames dances determine which lord will die tomorrow and which throne will change hands. The length of winter nights provided the perfect backdrop for these dark games. In medieval castle life, the fireplace was not just a place for warming up, it was a sacred space where political power was shaped, alliances were formed and broken, and death orders were given. Words spoken under the hypnotic effect of the fire could determine the fate of empires. The ideal time for plotting a conspiracy was winter evenings. Long nights, cold weather, and confined living conditions created perfect opportunities for secret meetings. During these periods when connection with the outside world was severed, intriguers could move freely and develop their plans without anyone noticing. Political circles formed around the fireplace had a strict hierarchy. The most powerful lords sat in the seat closest to the fire, while others took their places at a distance according to their power. Even this seating arrangement carried a political message, showing who was allied with whom. The masters of assassination plans were the elderly lords. These men, who had gained years of experience, had developed extremely subtle methods to eliminate their enemies. Poisons, murders made to look like accidents, secret stabbings, and even deaths resembling suicide through psychological pressure were planned. The most dangerous conversations took place while sitting across from each other in the dining hall. The shadows created by the flickering firelight hid facial expressions and made it difficult to understand the speaker's true intentions. This play of shadows worked in favour of the schemers and provided secrecy. Female intriguers were particularly dangerous. Noble ladies used this power, which men underestimated, to their advantage and surprised their enemies. Women who appeared to be embroidering by the fireplace were actually devising plans that would result in bloodshed. Fireplace meetings played a large role in the art of forming alliances. Two rival lords could draw closer in the warmth of the fire and cooperate for their common interests. But these alliances were usually temporary. They would betray each other at the first opportunity. Poison was the most common method of assassination. Poison could be mixed into the wine drunk by the fireplace, the food eaten, or even the air breathed. Toxic substances were usually obtained from natural-looking plant extracts and were very difficult to detect. Spies were an indispensable part of fireplace meetings. Agents disguised as servants listened to conversations and relayed important information to their masters. Sometimes multiple spies were present at the same meeting carrying out their duties without knowing each other. The most dangerous plans were long-term ones. It was necessary to follow an enemy for years, learn their habits, and wait for their weakest moment. These long-term plans formed by the fireplace were carried out with patience and composure. Letter games were also a common method of intrigue. Fake letters were prepared to set enemies against each other. These letters were usually destroyed by burning them in the fireplace, leaving no evidence. Religious authorities were also part of these political games. Priests and bishops influenced political decisions by speaking in the name of God, sometimes even giving orders for assassinations. Murders carried out under the guise of religious decrees were among the most cunning plans. Promises made by the fireplace were sacred, but also very dangerous. It was believed that if the person who swore an oath did not keep their word, they would receive both worldly and otherworldly punishment. For this reason, promises were generally kept but could be very skillfully circumvented. The most terrifying situations arose when there were family intrigues. A brother killing a brother, a son poisoning his father, or a wife having her husband killed were among the bitterest plans. Family ties held no meaning in the face of political interests. Even children were included in this world of intrigue. Young princes and princesses were used to gather information about their parents' enemies. Since they looked innocent, no one suspected them. Hand signals made in the firelight formed a secret language. Conspirators communicated silently with these signs and relayed information about their plans. This secret language was so advanced that even long conversations could be conducted with signs. The fireplace was also a tool for destroying evidence. Criminal evidence, letters, documents, and other traces were destroyed by burning them in the fire. The heat of the fire completely eliminated even the slightest clues. Music and poetry were also used as tools of intrigue. Messages hidden within song lyrics served as threats or warnings to rival lords. Musicians who played instruments in particular played a large role in this secret communication. Friendships formed by the fireplace were the most dangerous ones. During seemingly sincere conversations, enemies drew closer and learned each other's secrets. Later, they would use this information as a weapon. The most skillful assassinations were those made to look like accidents. Deaths that appeared natural, such as falling down the stairs, a horse accident, an injury during a hunt, or death in a fire, were actually carefully planned murders. In medieval castles, the fireplace functioned as the centre of political games and deadly intrigues. The warmth of the fire heated not only bodies, but also the darkest plans. When you get into bed to manage the night, even the air you exhale evaporates, and your sheets are ice cold. Your bedroom, tucked between thick stone walls, should be a sanctuary to escape the cold of the outside world, but it has actually turned into a trap carrying the risk of frostbite. Staying alive through a night in the Middle Ages was a game of survival that required creativity and patience, demanding bedroom battle tactics. Bedroom arrangement was the first front in the war against the cold. Thick fabric, skins and woolen covers were laid out layer upon layer. However, these materials usually attracted moisture and began to mould over time. Damp covers absorbed body heat and, paradoxically, could cause even more coldness. Beds were usually built high off the ground because cold air settled below. High bed frames allowed for the placement of heat sources underneath. Some wealthy families placed charcoal braziers or even hid hot brick pieces under the bed. While these methods were effective, they also carried a fire risk. The most common warming technique was the hot stone application. Stones heated in the fireplace were wrapped in thick cloths and placed at the foot of the bed. These stones gave off heat for hours, ensuring the feet stayed warm. However, stones that were too hot could create a risk of burns, while those that were too cold were useless. Bed sharing was one of the most practical solutions. Spouses, children, and even trusted servants shared the same bed to combine their body heat. This practice was not just for warmth, but also for security. Being alone during the length of winter nights was challenging both physically and spiritually. Various techniques had been developed to preserve breath heat. Pulling the covers over to cover the face created a natural warming by keeping the breath underneath. However, this method could lead to a lack of oxygen and sometimes posed a risk of suffocation. Clothing strategies were quite complex. Wearing very thick clothing restricted mobility and caused sweating. Once the sweating stopped, the body lost even more heat. The ideal solution was to dress in thin layers, but this luxury was not available to every castle resident. Pre-bed exercises were an effective way to increase body temperature. Simple gymnastic movements, stretching exercises, and walking fast accelerated blood circulation, ensuring one entered bed warmer. However, excessive exercise would cause sweating, which could have the opposite effect. Hot drinks were an important part of the pre-night ritual. Spiced wine, hot milk, and herbal teas increased the body temperature from within. Usually, warming spices such as honey, cinnamon, and cloves were added to strengthen their effects. Arranging the bedding correctly also required art. Thin covers were placed at the bottom with thick and heavy covers on top. This layering system allowed for the formation of air pockets, increasing the insulation effect. The edges of the covers were tightly tucked in to prevent cold air from entering. Bedroom ventilation required a fine balance. A completely closed room created a lack of air and caused headaches, while too much ventilation let the heat escape. Minimal ventilation was attempted by leaving small air holes. Combating winter depression was also an important factor affecting sleep quality. Long dark nights ruined the mood and led to sleep disorders. Activities such as reading by candlelight, listening to music, and conversing helped keep morale high. Special measures were taken for children. Since the rate of heat loss in young children is higher than in adults, they required extra protection. Children were usually placed between their parents to benefit maximally from their body heat. For elderly castle residents, the situation was even more critical. Old age slowed blood circulation and reduced resistance to the cold. Special heating methods were applied for these individuals, and they were kept under constant supervision. When someone fell ill, sleep strategies changed completely. While feverish patients might require cooling, extra warming measures were taken for those suffering from colds. In the event of illness, sleep was considered a vital part of the treatment. Security concerns also dictated sleep patterns. Locking doors and windows securely and keeping weapons within reach were part of the preparation against midnight attacks. Dreams and nightmares occurred more frequently during cold nights. Physical discomfort could transform into mental distress, leading to fearful dreams. These conditions lowered sleep quality and prevented rest. Morning awakening rituals were also part of the battle against the ice. Getting out of bed required great courage, as the body was suddenly exposed to cold air. Dressing quickly, warming up, and starting the daily routine were essential for survival. Nights spent in medieval castle bedrooms were full of stories of struggle. showing just how precious modern comfort standards are. Being able to sleep under such harsh conditions was a true achievement. The sight that greets you when you go down to the castle kitchen is not promising. Depleted provisions on the storage shelves, frozen water, and extinguished ovens await you. The responsibility of feeding the castle residents rests on your shoulders, but the ingredients you have are dwindling day by day, and their quality is deteriorating. Working in a medieval castle kitchen was an art of survival that required being a magician, creating miracles, and constantly coming face to face with death. The castle kitchen was one of the most challenging workspaces in winter. Thick stone walls trapped the cold and the humidity was very high. Cooks had to work in a constantly wet and cold environment. The risk of frostbite on the hands, the danger of catching diseases, and constant physical fatigue were inseparable parts of kitchen life. Fire control was the heart of the kitchen, but also its greatest threat. The oven fires, which had to burn continuously, were controlled very carefully due to the necessity of saving wood. If the fire went out, it could take hours to relit it. If you burned it too strongly, valuable wood was wasted. Establishing this balance required years of experience. Provision management was one of the greatest skills of the cooks. Food stocks prepared at the beginning of winter had to be distributed carefully until the end. Every day the expenditure was calculated, and the remaining amounts were constantly checked. A miscalculation meant starvation by late winter. The water issue was one of the most critical matters for the kitchen. Frozen wells, broken water systems, and contaminated water sources left cooks helpless. Sometimes it took hours to secure clean water. Carrying water was a separate torture, as heavy vessels were hauled across frozen ground. The art of salvaging spoiled food was the secret of the culinary profession. Scraping the mould off mouldy bread, separating sound parts from rotting vegetables, and trying to turn soured milk into cheese were parts of the daily routine. Nothing was thrown away. Every piece was valuable. Meat preservation techniques were quite complex. Meats protected by the methods like salting, drying, and smoking would begin to spoil over time. Heavy spices were used to hide the smell of spoiled meat, and long boiling aimed to kill harmful bacteria. Developing creative recipes became a necessity. Cooks, trying to make different meals with the same ingredients, sought maximum variety with limited resources. Bone broth soups, mixtures of vegetable scraps, and grain-based filling meals formed the basic menu. The kitchen hierarchy had strict rules. The head cook made every decision, and the assistants followed them to the letter. Even small mistakes could lead to severe punishments. Cooks who wasted provisions, burnt food, or violated hygiene rules could be punished with beatings. One of the worst-case scenarios was cases of food poisoning. Illnesses caused by spoiled food were considered the responsibility of the cooks. If castle residents fell ill, the cooks found guilty were punished severely, sometimes even killed. Nutritional diversity dropped nearly to zero in winter. Fresh fruits and vegetables were unavailable, and vitamin deficiencies became widespread. Cooks tried to compensate for this with dried fruits, pickled vegetables, and herbal teas. Kitchen tools became non-functional in the cold. Metal utensils became ice cold and would stick to the hand upon contact. Wooden tools absorbed moisture, cracked and broke. Tool maintenance and repair were constant tasks. Organising feeding for a crowd required great skill. Correct timing was essential to feed hundreds of people at once, and everyone's stomach had to be filled. The nobles ate first, then the servants. Disrupting this order could cause major problems. Food hygiene was attempted under primitive conditions. It was hard to find hot water for washing hands, and soap was considered a luxury. Since cleaning materials were limited, the risk of disease transmission was very high. Night shifts were particularly difficult. Preparations for the next day's meals were made, bread dough was prepared, and baking processes were started in the early hours. Working in a dark kitchen and using cutting tools by candlelight carried great risks. There was a constant threat of theft. Starving servants would try to steal food from the kitchen. Cooks had the responsibility of protecting the provisions, and they could be held accountable if a loss was detected. Drink production was also the responsibility of the kitchen. Wine, beer and fruit juices were prepared, and their quality was checked. Producing spoiled drink meant both a health risk and a loss of prestige. In cases of hosting guests, the pressure increased even more. Special meals had to be prepared for arriving guests, and service had to be of a quality that preserved the castle's prestige. Creating a luxurious appearance with limited resources required great art. In cases of illness, special nutrition programs were implemented. Soft meals, healing soups, and strengthening drinks were prepared for sick castle residents. These special diets were planned separately from normal meals and required extra resources. Waste management was also an important issue. Food scraps, bones and trash created both hygiene and security risks. These wastes had to be disposed of safely to protect against pests and rodents. Working in medieval castle kitchens was a demanding profession that required creativity, resilience, and constant problem-solving skills. The miracles these cooks achieved was proof of what could be done with limited means. You hear a crackle and wake up. The sound does not come from the pile of straw beneath you. It is the sound of your tears, frozen by the cold cracking on your face. The dark dungeon cell surrounding you is deep within the castle dungeons, the most savage punishment system of the Middle Ages. Here, every breath you take is a miracle. Every passing hour is evidence of the grueling struggle you wage between life and death. Surviving in this underground hell in winter is a torturous experience that pushes the limits of human will. The castle dungeons were underground labyrinths designed for the most horrific criminals. Surrounded by thick stone walls, these cells never saw daylight. They smelled only of dampness, decay and despair. In winter, these underground cells turned into literal freezing traps. The cell conditions were at subhuman levels. Narrow, low-ceilinged chambers were of a size where an adult could not stand properly. These places, with floors covered in mud, filth and animal waste, were areas where no hygiene rules applied. In winter, this filth would freeze, creating sharp ice. The sound of dripping water was a characteristic of the dungeons. Water constantly dripping from the ceiling fell onto the prisoners' heads and bodies. In winter, this water would turn into a mixture of ice, keeping the prisoners constantly wet and cold. The rhythm of the dripping sound would drive prisoners mad over time. The feeding system was a total tool of torture. Food given once a day usually consisted of pieces of rotten bread and murky water. In winter, these foods would freeze, making them difficult to chew. Often prisoners had to keep icy bread in their mouths just to melt it. No rights were granted regarding clothing. Prisoners were thrown into jail with the clothes they were caught in, and they wore nothing extra. These clothes would tear, rot, and become ineffective over time. In the winter months, exposed body parts were under constant risk of frostbite. Disease roamed freely through the dungeons. Due to cold, dampness, and nutritional deficiencies, prisoners fell ill very quickly. Colds, pneumonia, tuberculosis, and skin diseases were rampant. No treatment was provided for sick prisoners. They were simply left to die. Mental collapse usually arrived faster than physical decay. Darkness, silence, and isolation broke the prisoners' minds. It was common to see those who started having hallucinations, those who talked to themselves, and those who screamed. The length of the winter nights accelerated this mental breakdown. The most horrific method of punishment was water torture. Prisoners were submerged in dungeon waters and held there until the point of drowning. In the winter months, this torture became even more brutal because the water was ice cold. Prisoners experiencing body shock often died of heart attacks. The dungeon guards were also ruthless characters. These men did not enjoy treating prisoners humanely. They took pleasure in inflicting torture. Beating, humiliation, and psychological pressure were parts of their daily routine. They played games to set prisoners against each other. Group cells were even more dangerous. Situations where multiple prisoners were kept in the same cell led to conflict and violence. Fights over food, clashes over space, and the strong crushing the weak occurred frequently. In winter, these conflicts became even more intense. Death was a daily occurrence in the dungeons. Prisoners dying of cold, disease, or suicide were met with indifference. Sometimes the corpses of the dead were left in the cell for days, and other prisoners were forced to live alongside the rotting bodies. Escape attempts were nearly impossible. Thick walls, iron bars, and constant guard surveillance prevented escape. Prisoners caught attempting to escape were subjected to even harsher punishments and sometimes killed. Communication was completely forbidden. It was prohibited for prisoners to speak to each other, tap on the cell walls, or make any sound whatsoever. Those who violated this rule were punished with gagging, having their ability to speak taken away. Family visits were not allowed. Prisoners completely lost their connection with the world and could not receive news from their loved ones. This situation accelerated psychological collapse and broke the will to live. The most brutal types of punishment included shackling. Heavy chains were placed on the hands and feet of prisoners, completely restricting their mobility. These chains became ice cold in the winter months, creating frostbite upon contact with the skin. Light deprivation blinded the prisoners. People kept in darkness for months began to lose their sight. Prisoners who finally saw sunlight could experience burning and blindness in their eyes. Human dignity was targeted for total destruction. Prisoners had to ask for permission even for their basic needs. Often, this permission was denied, and they were forced to live in their own filth. Hope was systematically killed. Prisoners were not told their release dates, leaving their duration of stay uncertain. This uncertainty caused them to collapse spiritually. The varieties of torture were limitless. Physical tortures such as pricking fingertips with needles, pulling out nails, and breaking bones were considered normal. In winter, these tortures became even more agonizing. Spending a winter in medieval castle dungeons was one of the most horrific experiences in the dark history of humanity. Those who survived these conditions were considered to have experienced a true miracle of survival. With the first light of dawn, your thick boots slip on the icy courtyard stones, and every breath from beneath your heavy armour mixes into the air as white vapour. The sword you hold is ice cold and your fingers are frozen stiff. But the training cannot be stopped, because the enemy does not wait for spring. War can break out at any moment. For medieval knights, the winter months were not a time for rest, but the most demanding training period, and surviving this harsh preparation process was a victory in itself. Knight training became even more rigorous in winter. Training under cold weather conditions simulated real battle conditions, as many wars were fought during winter months. Since enemy armies would also have to fight under the same harsh conditions, knights had to be prepared. Morning training began before daybreak. Knights rose in the dark and took their places in the icy courtyards. Their first exercise would be running to increase body temperature. Although running on icy ground created a risk of slipping, it developed balance and agility. The process of donning armour took longer in winter. Cold metal could stick to the skin upon contact. First, thick fabrics were worn, then the armour pieces were attached one by one. This process could sometimes take an hour and required great concentration. Swordsmanship was the most challenging part. Standing on icy ground while swinging a heavy sword required great mastery. Holding a sword with frozen fingers was painful, but one had to learn to endure this pain because the same conditions would exist in real battle. Spear training was particularly dangerous. The movement of attacking with a spear while on horseback was very risky on icy ground. Both the horse and the rider were in danger of falling. Therefore, winter training was conducted more carefully and under control. Horseback riding training was one of the hardest parts of winter. Horses were also affected by the cold and acted more nervously. Riding a horse on icy ground posed a great danger to both the horse and the rider. For this reason, special horseshoes and anti-slip measures were taken. Shield work required arm strength. Carrying a heavy shield for hours was exhausting, but winter training developed this endurance. Although shield movements were more difficult on icy ground, they were learned that much more effectively. Group combat drills were the most entertaining part. Knights engaged in mock battles against each other in teams. These drills reflected the atmosphere of real war and developed teamwork. These clashes in snow-covered courtyards created a spectacular sight. Target practice required precision. Long-range attack techniques such as archery, spear throwing and stone throwing became more difficult in the cold. Wind, snow and ice conditions made calculations harder. Wrestling training required nudity. Knights would take off their armour and wrestle in the snow-covered courtyards. This both increased body resistance and developed close combat techniques. Falling onto the snow with a bare body served as a significant endurance test. Endurance tests were the most brutal part. Knights were forced to stand motionless under the snow for hours, testing their capacity to endure the cold. Those who fainted or gave up in these tests were considered failures. Weapon maintenance was an often neglected part of winter training. Cold and dampness caused weapons to rust. It was essential to clean, oil and protect the weapons after training. This maintenance routine was also a part of the education. Tactics lessons were held indoors. Battle plans, enemy tactics, and defense strategies were taught. These lessons provided mental development and increased strategic thinking abilities. Injuries occurred more frequently during winter training. Falls on icy ground, fractures and dislocations were common. Learning to deal with these injuries was part of the training. One had to endure pain and continue fighting even while injured. Nutrition was an important part of the training. Since knights consumed intense calories, they needed rich nutrition. Meat, bread, wine, and foods rich in vitamins were consumed. Proper nutrition increased training efficiency. Rest and recovery were also part of the program. Extremely intense training could cause muscle tears. Controlled rest, massage and hot baths relieved muscle fatigue. Morale and motivation were very important. The difficulty of winter training could demoralize the knights. Therefore, attempts were made to keep morale high with music, songs and stories. Competitive training increased motivation. Competitions held among the knights were organized to learn who performed better and who was more resilient. Winners were rewarded, while losers did extra training. Mental preparation was also key. Combat psychology, fear control and stress management were taught. Not panicking and maintaining composure in real war was of vital importance. Activities to improve team cohesion were conducted. Knights lived together, trained together, and knew each other well. This close bond could save lives during war. Leadership training was also provided. Knights who would become future commanders were trained in team management, decision-making and strategy determination. While the winter training of medieval knights may seem excessively harsh and dangerous by today's standards, it was an essential preparation considering the warfare conditions of that era. Those who passed through this rigorous training became true war machines. The last news from the outside world arrived 3 weeks ago. Since then you have seen the same faces within the thick stone walls. The only view you can glimpse from the window is a world frozen under a white blanket of snow, and a feeling of a space that narrows a bit more every day. You begin to hear strange sounds in your mind. Unfamiliar thoughts emerge, and it becomes increasingly difficult to distinguish between reality and imagination. Spending a winter in a medieval castle was an exhausting experience, not just physically, but also mentally and spiritually. Confinement syndrome was one of the most common psychological issues of castle life. Living within the same corridors, rooms and views for months disrupted people's mental balance, and the feeling that the walls were literally closing in on them became widespread. This manifested itself with symptoms similar to claustrophobia. Social tension increased over time. Being together with the same people constantly made even the smallest habits intolerable. Arguments in the dining hall, collisions in the corridors, and senseless fights became an ordinary part of daily life. Stagnation depression was one of the most common problems. Repeating the same routines every day and being in the same environment negatively affected brain chemistry, creating a deep sense of hopelessness. People began to question the meaning of life, were unable to dream about the future, and lost their motivation. Sleep disorders affected almost everyone. The weakening of the day-night cycle, lack of artificial light, and constant stress disrupted sleep patterns. Insomnia led to hallucinations, states of irritability, and aggressive behaviours. Communication breakdowns were also frequently seen. Castle residents who conversed with the same people for months eventually struggled to understand each other. Linguistic deterioration, unintelligible mutterings, and social withdrawal became widespread. Paranoia increased as the winter progressed. People began to suspect one another, producing conspiracy theories and experiencing trust issues. Stashing food, holding secret meetings, and mutual accusations were frequently observed. Memory problems were also common. Vitamin deficiencies, stress, and monotony weakened memory functions. People became unable to remember events that occurred in the recent past. This situation caused identity confusion and a distortion in the perception of time. Obsessive behaviours emerged in many individuals. Mirroring movements, counting habits, and meaningless routines became widespread. Although these actions developed to reduce anxiety, they led to other problems in the long run. The level of aggression rose significantly. Especially among young men, the tendency toward violence increased, and physical fights became more frequent. Emotional numbness emerged as a natural consequence of long-term stress. After a certain point, people became unable to feel their emotions, and indifference and social detachment developed. Religious mysticism was also an increasing phenomenon. Hopelessness directed people toward extreme religiosity. Collective prayer ceremonies, self-punishment rituals, and cases of mass hysteria could occur. Children were the group most affected by this process. Their mental development was negatively impacted, and behavioural disorders and emotional instabilities emerged. Alcohol consumption became widespread. Excessive drinking was used to cope with depression and anxiety, which caused both physical and spiritual harm in the long run and increased aggression. Women experienced additional stress due to social gender restrictions, lack of freedom of movement, and patriarchal pressures, leading to an increase in depression, anxiety, and hysteria cases among them. The weakening of leadership brought dangerous consequences. Even those in positions of authority could lose their decision-making abilities under psychological pressure. This created risks for the entire castle population. Incidents of self-harm increased. People driven to despair harmed themselves through methods like cutting or burning. Mass madness was a rare but real phenomenon. Sometimes a group of people could exhibit irrational behaviours simultaneously, and mass hysteria could be experienced. The distortion of time perception was common due to the monotonous environment and lack of external stimuli. People could not correctly perceive the passage of time, which increased anxiety. Identity confusion arose due to long-term isolation and restricted roles. Individuals began to question who they were and their purpose. The healing process was not easy, even when winter ended. Psychological damage does not heal on its own when spring arrives. Many people carried lifelong scars and required long-term therapy. Music, storytelling, games, and social events were organised as coping mechanisms. While these were not always successful, they provided a degree of relief. When evaluated in the light of modern psychology, the psychological effects of winter isolation in medieval castles were truly devastating. These experiences offer important lessons for today's understanding of mental health. As the flickering candle flame dances on the pages of the book, your eyes try to distinguish the letters, and you cling to one of the rare ways to pass the time on a long winter night. The small crowd gathered around you listens to every word you read with bated breath, because knowing how to read and write was a skill as rare as sorcery at that time. Winter nights in medieval castles were remembered as magical times when education and entertainment intertwined, knowledge was considered sacred, and stories came to life. Literacy was an extremely rare skill in the Middle Ages. Since the vast majority of castle residents could not read or write, those who were literate were very valuable. These individuals usually came from among the clergy, nobles, or specially trained servants. On winter nights, crowds would gather around people with this rare talent. Reading by candlelight required great mastery. The flickering flame created moving shadows, making it difficult to discern the letters. The reader had to both hold the book at the correct distance and constantly adjust the position of the candle. Long reading sessions caused eye fatigue and headaches. Books were extremely valuable items in that period. Every book was a treasure, handwritten, bound, and carefully preserved. The value of a book was sometimes equal to that of a house. Therefore, the books were treated very carefully, and great care was taken not to damage them. Religious books were the most common reading material. The Bible, prayer books, and the life stories of saints were the most read works on winter nights. These readings were both educational and provided moral support. Listeners found consolation in these stories and gained spiritual strength. Historical chronicles were also favourite reading materials. The adventures of old kings, war stories, and heroic epics fascinated the listeners. These stories both provided information and offered entertainment. Young men, in particular, were very influenced by these stories of heroism. Poetry reading was a special branch of art. Lyric poems, love stories, and epic works were read with a specific intonation. A good poetry reader could move listeners to tears or bring them to laughter. These performances were like real theatrical shows. Philosophy and science books, on the other hand, appealed to elite tastes. The works of Aristotle, mathematics books, and writings on natural sciences could only be understood by the educated class. These readings initiated intellectual debates and allowed for an exchange of ideas. Reading sessions became a social event. People of different ages came together and gathered around stories. The elderly shared their experiences, the youth asked questions, and children dreamed. These meetings strengthened intergenerational communication. The tradition of memorization was also very strong. People who were illiterate would memorize the stories they heard and pass them on to others. Thanks to this oral tradition, many stories were passed from generation to generation and preserved. Some individuals could memorize pages of text. The reading speed was very slow. These readings, which were well below the modern reading speed, allowed for the savouring of every word. Listeners found the opportunity to digest every sentence and grasp its meaning. This slowness also increased concentration. Discussion sessions were an inseparable part of reading. The read texts were discussed at length, and different interpretations were made. These discussions developed critical thinking skills and taught different perspectives. Writing lessons were also given on winter nights. Those who were literate would try to teach letters to those who were not. Attempts at writing on stone with pieces of charcoal were made, and basic writing skills were taught. Musical readings were special events. Some texts were read accompanied by music and presented as melodies. These presentations were both pleasing to the ear and made memorization easier. Stories in the ballad style in particular were read in this manner. Child education was an important part of these reading sessions. Moral values, rules of conduct, and life skills were taught to children through these stories. Storytellers were among the children's favourite people. Language teaching was also conducted during these sessions. Latin texts were read and word meanings were explained. In this way, the common folk began to learn the Latin language and could better understand church services. Copying was also a task for winter nights. Copies were made of valuable books, ensuring the spread of knowledge. This was a very difficult task, requiring immense patience, but it was necessary to preserve information. The tradition of story creation also flourished. Inspired by the stories they read, people would invent new tales and use their imaginations. This creativity was both entertaining and educational. Memory exercises were part of the reading activities. Memorizing long texts, remembering words, and correctly relaying stories ensured memory development. This skill was also very useful in daily life. Moral teachings were the primary goal of the stories. Distinguishing between good and evil, examples of correct behaviour, and social rules were taught through these stories. In this way, social order was preserved and values were passed on. Reading hours spent by candlelight in medieval castles were among the most beautiful traditions of humanity, where knowledge and entertainment met. These beautiful moments are worth remembering as lights of knowledge illuminating the darkness of winter nights. The odour emanating from your body has begun to bother even yourself, but everything necessary for washing is frozen. Water, soap, and even the place to wash are unusable. Your hair is greasy, your skin is dirty, and your clothes are covered in sweat, filth, and various stains. While hygiene was already difficult in the Middle Ages, the winter months made this hardship almost unbearable, and cleanliness ceased to be a luxury and became a figment of the imagination. In the winter months, the basic conditions required for cleanliness vanished. Water sources froze, soap hardened, and bathing areas became unusable. This situation created not just discomfort, but also serious health risks. The accumulation of filth increased the risk of infection and raised the probability of catching diseases. The water problem was the biggest source of the hygiene problem. Wells froze, water transport systems broke down, and obtaining hot water became nearly impossible. What little water could be found was reserved for drinking and cooking purposes and was not used for cleaning. This situation forced people to live for weeks without washing. Soap production and supply became very difficult in winter. Handmade soaps hardened in the cold and became unusable. Animal fats used in soap making froze, making the process impossible. Therefore, people had to try to clean themselves without soap. Bathing areas became non-functional in winter. Outdoor baths became unusable, and indoor areas were too cold. Bathing technology was in such a primitive state that washing in places without heating systems could lead to hypothermia. Changing clothes also posed a major problem. Since it was difficult to find spare clothing, people had to wear the same garments for weeks. These clothes became saturated with sweat, filth, and odour, reaching an unhygienic state. Washing laundry became nearly impossible. Hair care was one of the most neglected issues. People who could not find hot water to wash their hair left it unwashed for months. This situation created dandruff, itching, and even lice problems. Alternative methods for hair cleaning were sought, but they remained ineffective. Dental care was also quite poor. Since they lacked tools similar to toothbrushes, people tried to clean their teeth with their fingers or pieces of cloth. Oral hygiene deteriorated, and tooth decay and bad breath problems became widespread. Various methods were tried to mask body odour, but they were unsuccessful. Since perfume-like scents were very expensive, only the very wealthy could use them. The common folk tried to use herbal scents, but these could not be found in the winter months. For women, the hygiene issue was even more complex. It was very difficult to clean hygiene materials used during menstrual periods. Because pieces of cloth could not be washed, they were used repeatedly, which increased the risk of infection. Children were the most vulnerable group regarding hygiene. Since adults could not even attend to their own cleanliness, the necessary care for child hygiene could not be shown. This situation led to a higher risk of disease in children. For the elderly, the situation was even more dire. Elderly people who already struggled to clean themselves due to physical limitations became completely helpless in winter conditions. Because they could not receive help, their hygiene situation worsened significantly. The hygiene problem grew even larger in communal living areas. Dining halls, bedrooms, and common use areas became dirty quickly. Since cleaning could not be performed, this filth continued to accumulate, facilitating the spread of disease. In cases of illness, hygiene became even more critical. While the need for cleanliness increased for sick people, winter conditions made it impossible to meet this need. This prolonged the recovery process and could lead to complications. Kitchen hygiene also posed a major problem. It was very difficult to wash dishes, clean counters, and keep food preparation areas hygienic. This increased the risk of food poisoning and led to stomach ailments. Animal care also increased the hygiene problem. Animals living inside the castle caused foul odours and disease risks because they could not be cleaned. Animal waste could not be cleared, creating an unhygienic environment. In social life, the lack of hygiene created major problems. People hesitated to approach one another, and social distance increased. This led to both psychological and social problems. Alternative cleaning methods were attempted, but they remained insufficient. Dry cleaning, cleaning with snow and herbal methods were tried, but true hygiene could not be achieved. The risk of disease transmission was the most serious consequence of the lack of hygiene. Infectious diseases spread rapidly, and epidemics could break out. In this case, the health of the castle residents was in serious danger. Moral collapse was the psychological consequence of the hygiene problem. People began to feel disgusted with themselves, lost self-confidence, and fell into depression. This lowered the general quality of life and reduced the level of happiness. The hygiene problems experienced in medieval castles during winter were bitter experiences showing how valuable modern cleaning standards are. These hardships proved how important humanity's development regarding hygiene is. Loud voices coming from a corner of the Great Hall wake you, and you realise that the argument between two lords has now turned into shouting. This small disagreement that started this morning has now reached the point of a dual threat with hands-on swords. Separated from the outside world and forced to live within the same walls for months, the patience of the nobles has come to an end, and even the smallest spark has become capable of causing great explosions. Spending a winter in a medieval castle was a challenging experience that required struggling not only with the cold but also with the anger and violence born of confinement. The enclosure brought by the winter months brought tension among the noble class to a peak. These people, who in normal times could relieve their stress by hunting, travelling and communicating with the outside world, were stuck with the same spaces and the same people throughout the winter. This created psychological pressure and could lead to major fights even over the smallest matters. Hierarchy conflicts were one of the most common causes of fighting. The noble order within the castle was complex, and everyone's position was a constant subject of debate. Details such as who would sit where, who would eat before whom, and who would have a say in which matters created constant tension. Inheritance issues were also a major source of conflict. Since deaths increased during the winter months, inheritance matters frequently came to the agenda. Inheritance feuds broke out between brothers, cousins, and even friends. These fights sometimes ended bloodily. Marriage agreements were also a source of tension. Engagement and wedding ceremonies organised during the winter months became areas where the interests of different families clashed. Families who could not agree on the marriage of the youth could become enemies and start feuds that would last for generations. Commercial disagreements also caused fights. Arguments would break out among nobles who could not agree on issues such as land ownership, tax rates, and trade rights. These discussions sometimes turned into violence. Matters of money could end friendships and create long-lasting enmities. Conflicts also arose in military matters. Issues such as who would hold which military rank, who would be subordinate to whom in the event of war, and how military expenses would be shared were constant subjects of debate. When disagreements occurred on these matters, they could even result in duels. Disputes over women could create very serious fights. Rivalry between Issa, two men trying to catch the attention of a lady, could sometimes lead to fatal duels. Love triangles created great dramas within the castle. Prestige races were a constant source of tension. Subjects such as who dressed better, who wore more expensive jewellery, and who lived more luxuriously were constant points of comparison. This environment of competition created jealousy and hostility. Even religious matters could spark fights. Theological debates would begin among nobles with different religious views. These discussions could turn into personal attacks. Religion was such a sensitive issue that a small disagreement could lead to a larger fight. Alcohol consumption intensified the fights. Since drink consumption increased during the winter months, drunken brawls became common. Nobles under the influence of alcohol said things they wouldn't say in normal times and displayed behaviours they couldn't control. Disagreements also arose regarding child education. Issues such as how each child would be educated, from whom they would take lessons, and what positions they would be appointed to in the future created tension between families. Fights over the future of children could be very harsh. Even the dining table arrangement could be a subject of conflict. Details like who would sit where, which dishes would be served, and who would receive service first created constant arguments. These seemingly insignificant matters caused serious clashes because they were indicators of status. Hunting rights also created disagreements. Issues such as which hunting ground belonged to whom, how the spoils would be shared, and who would use the hunting equipment caused fights. Since hunting was a matter of both sport and prestige, the competition was very intense. Hosting guests also created tension. Disagreements arose over how incoming guests would be welcomed, who would host which guest, and how expenses would be shared. Because hospitality was a matter of prestige, fights occurred. Fights among young nobles were particularly violent. The high energy of the youth, their lack of experience, and their impatience intensified the brawls. Power struggles among young men sometimes became uncontrollable. Noble women were also involved in fights. The rivalry among noble women, gossip wars, and intrigues were no less dangerous than the men's fights. Women's fights could be more subtle but just as effective. Elderly nobles, thanks to their experience, could either fuel or settle the fights. Some elderly lords managed to set the youth against each other, using the fights for their own interests, while others tried to seek peaceful solutions. Dual traditions determined how the fights were resolved. Disagreements that became a matter of honour were attempted to be settled by duel, and these duels could sometimes end in death. Because duel rules were complex, new disagreements could emerge. Reconciliation rituals had also been developed. Various ceremonies and rituals were applied to reconcile fighting parties. These reconciliation processes were sometimes effective, and long-term friendships could be established. Noble fights during the winter months in medieval castles were striking examples showing human nature's reaction under stress. These fights formed an inseparable part of castle life as both dangerous and inevitable social events. As your foot reaches for the next step, it suddenly slips, and the stone railing you try to grab onto for balance is covered in ice. As your body falls uncontrollably backward, the only thing crossing your mind is how this fall will end. In medieval castles, the winter months were a dangerous period, when every step carried a potential risk of accident. Crossing the stairs required courage, and daily life came face to face with death. Castle architecture made falling accidents inevitable. Narrow and steep stairs leading to high towers, slippery stone steps, and inadequate railings turned these already dangerous structures into death traps during the winter months. With the addition of ice, the stairs literally became sliding rinks. Ice formation occurred in various ways. Water dripping from the roof froze on the steps. Condensation from breath moisture created thin layers of ice on surfaces. And water resulting from melting snow froze at night to create dangerous surfaces. These layers of ice were often invisible, leading to sudden surprises. The most dangerous stairs were the tower stairs. A person falling on narrow spiral stairs could roll all the way to the bottom. Such falls usually resulted in multiple fractures and sometimes even ended in death. Tower stairs became even more dangerous, especially on windy days. For elderly castle residents, the situation was even more dire. Elderly people whose mobility was already restricted were almost helpless on icy stairs. Recovery times after a fall were very long, and complications increased. Some elderly people never left their rooms due to the fear of falling. For children, icy stairs were deadly traps. Children who moved quickly because they were small and agile lost control when they encountered ice. Child falls usually resulted in head trauma and could leave permanent damage. For pregnant women, stair accidents created a double danger. These accidents, carrying risks for both the mother and the baby, usually ended with tragic results. Since the balance of pregnant women was already compromised, the risk of falling increased. Stairs were extra dangerous for those carrying heavy loads. People whose field of vision was restricted and whose centre of gravity had shifted could fall very easily on icy steps. The heavy loads they carried caused additional injuries after the fall. Using stairs at night became especially risky. It was almost impossible to see the ice in the dark. Candlelight provided inadequate illumination, and shadows could be misleading. In the silence of the night, the sound of falling down the stairs woke the entire castle. First aid opportunities after a fall were very limited. Since there were no modern medical intervention methods, falling accidents often left permanent damage. Bone fractures, incorrect healing, and detection of internal bleeding were impossible. There was no treatment for head trauma. The most common types of injuries were bone fractures. Fractures of the arms, legs, and ribs were among the frequent injuries. The treatment of these fractures was done with primitive methods, often leading to incorrect healing. Mobility could be permanently restricted. Head traumas were the most serious injuries. Heads hitting stone steps could sustain heavy damage, lose consciousness, or even lead to death. Since brain hemorrhage could not be diagnosed, many head traumas resulted in death. Internal bleeding played the role of a silent killer. Internal injuries invisible from the outside could not be diagnosed or treated. Even if the person who fell appeared normal, damage to internal organs could lead to death over time. Spinal injuries led to the most horrific consequences. Blows to the neck and back area could cause paralysis, leaving a person disabled for life. Treatment for spinal injuries was impossible at that time. The psychology of falling was also an important factor. People who experienced a serious fall once could develop a fear of stairs, becoming unable to lead their normal lives. This fear led to social isolation and lowered the quality of life. Protective measures were very limited. Simple methods like sprinkling salt, throwing sand, or spreading straw were tried, but these remained inadequate. Adding railings or repairing stairs was a very expensive and difficult task. Servants were the group most at risk. These people, who had to use the stairs constantly, faced great risks several times a day. Servant deaths were met as normal, and a replacement would be brought in. Soldiers were also in the high-risk group. Falling while wearing heavy armour was difficult enough to recover from, but in icy conditions, it became nearly impossible. When an armoured soldier fell, the severity of the injury increased. Rescue operations were also dangerous. Those trying to save the fallen person were exposed to the same risks, leading to secondary accidents. Carrying a stretcher on those stairs was practically impossible. Fall statistics were horrific. During the winter months, stair accidents tripled and death rates increased dramatically. At least one serious falling accident occurred every day, and several deaths happened every week. These accidents, which also had serious social consequences, upended family economies. People who became unable to work turned into a burden for their families, leading to severe livelihood struggles. The accidents on the icy stairs of medieval castles remain as bitter memories, showing how vital modern occupational safety standards are. When you crack open the granary door, the scent that wafts in evokes mixed emotions, a blend of the promising smell of grain and the alarming scent of mould. While checking your food stocks, which you carefully gathered for the winter, you remember that they are decreasing a bit more every day. Some are starting to rot, and spring is still months away. In the Middle Ages, surviving through the winter months depended on the ability to protect food from rotting, and this skill literally became a matter of life and death. Food preservation technology was the fundamental requirement for survival in the Middle Ages. In this era, without modern refrigerators and canning technology, protecting food from decay was a branch of art requiring great mastery. The survival of every family depended on how well they applied these preservation techniques. The salting method was the most common preservation technique. Heavy salt was used to protect protein sources like meat and fish. Salt would draw out moisture, preventing bacteria from multiplying and slowing the decay of the food. However, if the salting process was not done correctly, the food could still spoil, leading to a waste of precious salt. The drying method was one of the oldest preservation techniques. The moisture content of fruits, vegetables, meat, and fish was reduced by drying them in the sun or wind. This method became difficult in winter due to the lack of sun. Drying was attempted in enclosed spaces, often near fires, but this could create a fire risk. The smoking technique was used especially for meat and fish. In specially constructed smokehouses, food was kept under smoke for days. The smoke killed bacteria and gave the food a specific flavour. However, this method was expensive as it required high wood consumption. Preserving in wine and vinegar was also a common method. The acidic environment prevented bacteria from multiplying and kept the food fresh for longer. Vegetables were kept in vinegar and meats in wine. The disadvantage of this method was that wine and vinegar were expensive. The technique of preservation in oil was used especially by wealthy families. Olive oil, butter, or animal fats isolated the food from the air, preventing rot. Although this method was effective, it had limited use due to the cost of oil. Storing underground was an old but effective method. Root vegetables and grains were kept in specially prepared pits. The natural insulation of the earth prevented temperature fluctuations and provided constant humidity. However, rats and other rodents could damage these stores. Preservation with honey was a luxury method. Honey's natural antibacterial properties protected food from rotting. Fruits and some meats could be kept in honey. Since honey was very expensive, it was only used for the most valuable foods. The fermentation technique was used for both preservation and increasing nutritional value. Cabbage was turned into sauerkraut, milk into cheese, and grains were fermented. Fermented foods lasted longer and had increased nutritional value. Freezer preservation was a natural advantage of the winter months. Food was kept frozen, stopping the decay process. However, freeze-thaw cycles could ruin the texture of the food and lead to changes in taste. The art of arranging the granary was very important. Correct sequencing of food, ventilation systems, and moisture control were essential for successful storage. Incorrect arrangement could lead to the spoiling of all stocks, causing starvation. The fight against mould required a constant war. Mould spread quickly in damp granaries and could make large amounts of food unusable. Mouldy parts had to be cleaned immediately to prevent spreading. Pest control was also critical. Mice, insects, and other vermin were the greatest enemies of food stores. Cats were kept, traps were set, and storage areas were kept under tight control. Portion control required long-term planning. How the consumption program would be followed throughout the winter was calculated in advance and daily portions were determined. A balance had to be struck between the risk of finishing early and the threat of hunger. Quality control was a daily task. Stored food was checked every day, and those starting to spoil were culled. early intervention could prevent the loss of the entire stock and provide partial salvage. Alternative protein sources were also evaluated. Due to the difficulty of finding fresh meat in winter, proteins were sought from dried insects, fish, bone powder and bone meal. Storing water was also a separate art. Special techniques were applied so that drinking water wouldn't freeze and its cleanliness was maintained. Since tainted water could make the entire family sick, water quality was very important. Seed preservation was of vital importance for the following year. Seeds for planting were specially protected and kept from rotting or germinating. Losing seeds meant starvation for the next year. Preparing a backup plan was also necessary. Emergency reserves were kept to be used if the main food stock spoiled. These reserves usually consisted of the most durable and least preferred foods. Social cooperation increased storage success. Sharing food among neighbouring families, exchanging information, and communal storage practices increased the chances of survival. The art of winter food preservation in the Middle Ages was one of the most striking examples of the grueling struggles that show how revolutionary modern food technology is. In your dream, you are lying under the sun and on a tropical island. Your whole body feels warm and comfortable, but suddenly you wake up and in the real world, your teeth are chattering, your toes are numb, and you are shivering curled up under the blankets. Tonight, sleep has fled from you. The discomfort provided by the cold will not allow you to rest. Winter sleep in medieval castles consisted of agonizing hours spent dreaming of warmth instead of real rest, and almost no one could get quality sleep. The body struggling with the cold disrupted the natural sleep cycle. The human body needs a certain temperature level to sleep. If this temperature cannot be provided, sleep quality drops dramatically. The icy atmosphere of the castle rooms completely upended this natural cycle, leaving people sleep-deprived. Climbing sleep, muscle tension, had become the most common problem. Muscle fibers shivering from the cold were constantly tense and could find no opportunity to relax. This muscle tension prevented moving into deep sleep, causing superficial and interrupted sleep. Dream content changed dramatically. The dreams of castle residents constantly revolved around warmth, the sun, fire, and tropical places. These dreams were so common that even dream interpreters began to accept this situation as normal. The frequency of waking up increased throughout the night. The cold woke people every half hour, and hours would pass before they could sleep again. This constant cycle of waking and sleeping led to mental fatigue and lowered performance the next day. Sleep problems in children were even more serious. Because their small bodies experienced heat loss more quickly, children cried throughout the night, waking their parents. The entire family remained sleep-deprived and everyone's quality of life decreased. The sleep situation of the elderly was the most dire. Their already disrupted sleep patterns were completely upended by the cold. Elderly castle residents stayed awake for hours at night, shivering until morning. In communal bedrooms, sleep was even more difficult. In situations where many people shared the same room, everyone's sleeplessness affected each other, and constant activity occurred in the room. When one woke up, the others would too, leading to collective sleeplessness. Nightmares also increased. The physical stress caused by the cold triggered fearful dreams. People saw nightmares throughout the night. The fear of freezing to death was reflected in these dreams, causing psychological trauma. Sleep positions were constantly changed, but comfort could not be found. People tossed and turned all night, trying to reach a position where they would feel the least cold. This constant movement further ruined the quality of sleep. Difficulty waking up in the morning had become a widespread problem. People who could not get quality sleep at night struggled significantly to get up in the morning and had difficulty fulfilling their daily duties. The tendency to doze off during the day increased. Castle residents who couldn't sleep at night tried to nap at any opportunity during the day, but this only disrupted their night's sleep further. A vicious cycle was formed and the sleep problem deepened. Common warming strategies were developed. Families shared their body heat by sleeping together, and children were placed between their parents. While this method worked partially, it could create privacy issues. Dreaming of warmth had become a sleep technique. People consciously tried to sleep by imagining warm places, attempting to heat themselves mentally. This technique sometimes worked. The use of alcohol as sleep aid increased. People tried to create a sense of warmth in their bodies by consuming alcohol before sleep, hoping to benefit from its sedative effect. However, since alcohol ruined sleep quality, it created problems in the long run. Breathing techniques were developed. People trying to heat the area under the blanket by exhaling warm breath practiced special breathing exercises. Although this method provided temporary relief, it was not a permanent solution. Efforts to warm up through movement were made. Leg movements in bed, finger exercises, and muscle tension relaxation techniques were applied. These movements increased blood circulation and provided temporary warmth. Hot drink rituals became widespread. Before sleeping, people tried to warm their bodies from the inside by drinking hot tea, milky drinks, or spicy mixtures. These rituals also provided psychological comfort. The tradition of storytelling was used as a sleep aid. By telling stories that spoke of warm climates and sunny days, they tried to achieve mental warming. Prayer and meditation techniques were used for sleep. People trying to forget the cold through religious prayers and mental focus exercises sought relief through spiritual methods. Herbal mixtures were tried as sleep medicines, but they were not very effective. Mixtures prepared with the few plants available in winter provided temporary relief but could not solve the fundamental problem. Nourishing hopes for the future became a sleep technique. Finding consolation in thoughts of spring's arrival and the return of warm days, people tried to sleep by holding on to hope. The winter sleep problems experienced in medieval castles were bitter experiences showing how valuable modern bedroom comfort is. These sleepless nights were grueling tests pushing the limits of human endurance. To pass the night, you lean against the furry belly of your dog and feel a bit relieved by the warmth you receive from its body heat. Alongside the sounds of horses coming from the stable below, the purring of the cat curled up at the foot of your bed reaches your ears. In the Middle Ages, the relationship between humans and animals was not just a working partnership but also a mutual struggle for warming and survival. Animal heat had literally become a life-saving resource. This precious partnership found its deepest meaning on winter nights. Dogs in castle life were not just guards but also life-saving heat sources. These loyal animals shared their body heat by sleeping next to humans on cold nights, providing natural protection against the danger of freezing. The tradition of sleeping with dogs was so common that almost every family kept at least one dog in their bedrooms. Castle dogs came in various sizes. Large dogs were particularly valuable because they produced more heat, but small dogs were also advantageous because they took up less space and could sleep more comfortably next to children. Dog selection was based not only on character and skill, but also on heat-producing capacity. Establishing close relationships with horses was also a common practice. Stable workers would sleep next to the horses on cold nights, benefiting from the body heat of these large animals. Horse stables thus became popular sleeping places during the winter months, and competitions for space occurred among the servants. Cat companionship was very common, especially among women and children. Cats' high body temperature and their ability to sleep comfortably made them ideal bed companions. A cat sleeping on your chest could provide warmth and comfort for hours. Poultry were also used for warming purposes. Chickens and geese were sometimes taken inside the homes, sharing the same space with humans, especially on very cold nights. Although this practice had hygiene issues, it was tolerated because survival was the priority. The warmth of goats and sheep was also utilised. These animals brought double benefits as they provided both milk and heat. Especially sick children were fed with goat milk while also benefiting from the goat's warmth. The locations of animal shelters were determined strategically, arranged to ensure maximum heat sharing. Stables and pens were built as close as possible to the living areas, providing quick access when necessary. The communal living arrangement required complex rules. Matters such as which animal would sleep where and who would sleep with which animal were determined with careful planning to prevent conflicts. Animal hierarchy could even affect human hierarchy. In cases of illness, animal warmth became even more critical. While cold applications were needed for feverish patients, warm animal contact could be life-saving for patients with hypothermia. Dogs and cats acted as natural thermostats. Animal companionship was especially important for children. Because their small bodies experienced heat loss rapidly, children needed animal warmth more. Parents tried to protect their children by letting them sleep with animals. The elderly also benefited greatly from animal warmth. As the aging body loses its capacity to produce heat, it needs external heat sources more. Elderly people with loyal dogs could live longer. Animal warmth was particularly valuable for pregnant women. The increased need for heat during the pregnancy process was met through animal companions, and this closeness continued after birth. Infants and small animals could grow up together. Sick animals also received warmth from humans. This relationship of mutual benefit contributed to both animal and human health, and communal healing processes could occur. While warming your sick dog in your lap, you would also benefit from its heat. Providing animal food required a collective effort. Since animal feed was scarce in winter, people had to share their own food, which increased the bond with the animals. A hungry animal was a cold animal, and a cold animal provided no heat. Hygiene problems were serious but secondary. Although animal parasites, odours and filth were bothersome, these problems were tolerated because survival was the priority. Weekly cleaning routines were a condition for maintaining animal companionship. The security function was also important. Animals functioned as both heat sources and security systems. Night watch dogs provided both warmth and protection, creating double benefits. Emotional bonds were also strong. Deep emotional ties developed between humans and animals experiencing a partnership for survival. These bonds could last a lifetime. This emotional closeness also provided moral support during difficult winter nights. The loss of an animal created great trauma. A person who lost a loyal animal companion experienced a great loss, both emotionally and physically, going through difficult days until finding a new one. Food sharing was subject to strict rules. When you shared food with animals, careful planning was required so that neither of you went hungry. This sharing was actually an investment, as a well-fed animal produced more heat. Seasonal changes affected animal relationships. Relationships between animals and humans, which were distant during the summer months, became very close in the winter and returned to balance with the arrival of spring. The search for animal warmth in medieval castles constituted one of the most intimate and functional examples of humanity's relationship with nature. This relationship of mutual benefit brought with it not only survival, but also mutual love and loyalty. Good night.